You ever get that feeling that there's an architect inside your mind? Someone who's designing your entire experience of life. Drafting the blueprints for your joy, but also for your deepest anxieties? Well, let's dive into that, because that architect, it has a name.
I mean, really think about that. What if that nagging feeling of not being good enough, or that deep fear of failure, or the way you replay past mistakes over and over, what if none of that is random? What if it's all part of a deliberate, though maybe flawed, design? Today we're going to explore this internal architect, what we often call the ego.
Now, when we say ego, we're not just talking about being arrogant or having a big head. No, we're talking about something way more fundamental. It's that constant voice in your head, the one that says, I, me, and mine. It's the narrator of your life story, the constructed identity you carry around with you every single day.
So, how does this architect even work? Well, at its core, the ego is really just a survival mechanism. Its whole job is to create a stable, continuous sense of self out of this chaotic storm of thoughts, feelings, and experiences we call life. And it does this by drawing lines in the sand. It says, okay, this is my body. These are my thoughts. That is my accomplishment. In other words, this is me. And everything else? Well, that becomes not me or the other. Now, this separation is super useful for, navigating the world, but it's also the source of some really big problems. And this is where the first huge problem comes crashing in. Because this architect, well, it builds our identity on a pretty shaky foundation. And that foundation is fear. If your whole sense of me is built from things, that identity becomes incredibly fragile. Just think about it for a second. The ego identifies with things that are by their very nature temporary. Your job, your looks, your social status, even your opinions. And because all of those things can change or be taken away in an instant, the ego lives in this constant, low-grade hum of terror about its own non-existence, its own annihilation. And you can see how this deep, existential fear pops up in our daily lives. That fear of failure, it's not really about a project going wrong. It's a threat to the ego's identity as the competent one. The fear of rejection is a direct threat to its story of being worthy or lovable. This is what pulls us out of the present and traps us in anxiety about what might happen or regret over what did happen. The spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle just nails it with this quote. He says that most of our psychological fear, when you really trace it back to its source, is just the ego fighting for its own survival. This fear becomes the constant background noise of a self that knows, deep down, that it's fundamentally insecure. So this defensive crouch doesn't just create fear inside of us. It also sets the stage for our second major problem, conflict. That very same protective mechanism, it inevitably creates friction with other people. You see, to feel solid and real, the ego needs contrast. It actually strengthens itself by being right, or by being superior, or even by being the one who is longed. It needs an us versus them dynamic to really define its own borders. Without an other to push against, the ego's sense of self starts to feel kind of weak and blurry. And you've seen this play out a million times, right? A simple disagreement comes up, but the ego doesn't just hear information. It hears a personal attack on its identity, and bam, the defenses go up. Suddenly, it's not about the issue anymore, it's about survival. And that desperate need to be right completely steamrolls any chance of connection or empathy. This is such a powerful idea. The ego doesn't just accidentally stumble into conflict. On an unconscious level, it's actively looking for it. Things like grudges, resentment, arguments, that's the fuel that keeps the ego's fire burning hot, reinforcing its whole sense of being separate. Okay, so we've got fear and we've got conflict. The culmination of all these ego patterns is what many spiritual traditions call psychological suffering. And it's really important to make a key distinction here. Pain, well, pain is inevitable. It's just part of the deal of being alive. Life involves loss, disappointment, and hurt. But suffering is different. Suffering is the layer of story that the ego adds on top of the pain. The pain is the sting of losing a job. The suffering is the ego's narrative. This shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a total failure. My life is over. That story is the real source of our suffering. Ultimately, suffering is created in that gap between the ego's demands for how life should be and the reality of how life actually is. It's a fundamental rejection of this present moment, all in favor of a mental story. Okay, I know this all sounds pretty bleak, right?
The ego as the source of all our fear, conflict, and suffering. But here's the good news. Understanding the architect is the first step to renovating the house. So let's talk about the path to freedom from its tyranny.
This right here, this is the absolute game changer. It's the moment you realize that there's a voice in your head, and then there's you, the consciousness that is aware of that voice. Just by noticing the thought, I am afraid, you create a tiny bit of space. And in that space, the thought starts to lose its absolute power over you. So how do you actually practice this? How do you cultivate this inner witness? Well, you start by just observing your thoughts without judging them. Instead of being the thought, I'm not good enough, you learn to just notice it. Ah, there's that not good enough story again. This creates distance. Then you anchor yourself in the present moment, the feeling of your breath, the sound of the world around you. Why? Because the ego thrives on past regrets and future anxieties. It has almost zero power in the simple reality of right now. With a little practice, you start to spot the ego's patterns as they happen, that little flash of defensiveness in a conversation, the urge to win a pointless argument. And this awareness naturally leads to compassion, because you start to see the same universal struggle in literally everyone.
And let's be super clear here. This is not about going to war with your ego. That would just be another ego game, right? The path to liberation isn't about destruction. It's about disidentification. It's about a fundamental shift in your identity, from being the voice in your head to being the silent, aware presence that's watching it all happen. Which leaves us with one final, pretty profound question to ponder. When that narrator finally goes quiet, when the constant story of me and my life takes a pause, who are you really?